The morning sunlight spilled over the quiet streets of Maplewood, turning the brick buildings into a patchwork of warm reds and golds. On the corner of Main Street stood Elliot's barbershop, its striped red and white poles spinning lazily outside. The shop's windows gleamed, reflecting the early bustle of the small town. Inside, Elliot Lane stood in his usual spot, the clippers in his hand buzzing softly as he finished a trim for one of his regulars. Elliot was a man in his late 40s, with a salt and pepper beard and a kind, weathered face that always seemed ready to break into a smile. His hands were steady, his movements precise. This barbershop wasn't just his livelihood, it was his sanctuary. "There you go, Mr. Riley," Elliot said, brushing stray hairs from the older man's collar. "Looking sharp as ever." Mr. Riley chuckled. "You're a miracle worker, Elliot. Same time next month." "You know where to find me," Elliot replied, smiling as his customer left. The little bell above the door jingled again. But this time, the person entering was not a familiar face. A boy no older than 10 stepped inside hesitantly. His oversized shirt hung off his frame, and his sneakers were worn down to the soles. His shaggy hair looked like someone had taken a pair of dull scissors to it. His eyes darted nervously around the shop as he lingered by the door. Elliot noticed him immediately. "Hey there, buddy," he called out warmly. "Come on in. What can I do for you today?" The boy hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I need a haircut," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't have any money. I can come back later. Sorry for bothering you." Elliot's heart ached at the boy's timid words. He set his clippers down and walked over, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "No need to apologize. Come have a seat. We'll get you fixed up." The boy's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," Elliot said with a reassuring nod. "Everyone deserves a fresh haircut. Don't worry about the money." After a moment's hesitation, the boy climbed into the chair, clutching the armrests, as though afraid it might vanish if he let go. Elliot draped a cape around him and smiled. "What's your name, kiddo?" "Jamie," the boy said quietly. "Well, Jamie, let's get you looking sharp," Elliot said, picking up his scissors. "Any particular style you're going for?" Jamie shrugged, his small frame relaxing slightly as Elliot began to work. The barber chatted with him gently, asking about school, favorite books, and hobbies. Little by little, Jamie opened up. He talked about how much he loved soccer but didn't have cleats, how he tried to practice with his friends but often had to sit out during games. Elliot listened, nodding thoughtfully as he shaped Jamie's uneven hair into something neat and clean. When he was done, Jamie stared at his reflection in the mirror, his expression shifting from disbelief to pure joy. "Wow," Jamie breathed, running his fingers through his neatly trimmed hair. "I look awesome." Elliot smiled, patting Jamie on the shoulder. "Told you everyone deserves to feel good. And Jamie, you're always welcome here." The boy beamed, hopping down from the chair. "Thank you, Mr. Elliot. I'll tell everyone you're the best barber in town." As Jamie bounded out the door, his steps lighter than when he'd entered, Elliot watched with a faint smile. He turned back to his station, tidying up for the next customer. "Quite the act of kindness," a voice said from the corner of the shop. Elliot turned to see Charles Davenport, a well-dressed man in his 40s, standing by the magazine rack. Charles was a regular at the shop, known for his tailored suits and quiet demeanor. He often came in late afternoons for his usual trim, blending into the background as Elliot worked. "What's that?" Elliot asked. Giving the boy a free haircut, Charles said, stepping forward. "Do you do that often?" Elliot shrugged, brushing off the question with his usual modesty. "From time to time. It's no big deal." "I'd say it's a very big deal," Charles replied, his tone thoughtful. "Doesn't it strain your business?" Elliot chuckled. "I'm not exactly rolling in cash, but I get by." What's the point of having a skill if you can't use it to help someone now and then? Charles tilted his head, studying the barber. And if you had the resources to do more? To help more people like that boy? Elliot frowned slightly, leaning on the counter. I've never thought about it. I just do what I can, with what I have. Charles didn't press further, but an idea had begun to take shape in his mind. He sat down in the chair, gesturing for Elliot to begin. When you're ready, I could use a trim myself. Elliot went to work, the familiar rhythm of cutting hair grounding him. Meanwhile, Charles's thoughts wandered. As an investor, he had spent years spotting potential where others saw none. Today he saw something extraordinary, not in profit margins or market trends, but in the quiet generosity of a small-town barber. By the time his haircut was finished, Charles had made up his mind. As the little bell above the door jingled and Charles left the shop, he smiled to himself. He had come in for a trim, but he was leaving with a plan, a way to turn one small act of kindness into something far greater. The following week, Elliot's barbershop was busy as usual, with a steady flow of customers coming in for trims, shaves, and the friendly conversation they had come to expect from the small-town barber. Elliot moved from chair to counter, his hands working deftly, his focus entirely on his customers. As the afternoon quieted, the little bell above the door chimed. Elliot looked up and saw Charles Davenport entering, carrying a leather notebook and 2 cups of coffee. His sharp suit and polished shoes were out of place in the rustic charm of the shop, but his easy smile put Elliot at ease. "Afternoon, Elliot," Charles said, setting one of the coffees on the counter. "Thought you might need a pick-me-up." "Thanks, Charles," Elliot replied, wiping his hands on a towel before taking a sip. "What brings you by?" Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened his notebook, flipping through several pages of neatly written notes and charts. He looked up, his expression somewhere between excitement and determination. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Charles began. "About doing what you can with what you have." Elliot frowned slightly, unsure of where this was going. "What about it?" Charles leaned on the counter, his gaze steady. "You've got something special here, Elliot. It's not just the haircuts, it's the kindness, the connection, the hope you're giving people. That boy, Jamie, he'll remember what you did for him for the rest of his life." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "That's kind of you to say, but this shop is just, well, it's just a little barbershop." "It's more than that," Charles insisted. "And I want to help you make it bigger. I'm talking about a partnership, Elliot. I'll provide the funding to expand your business, hire more barbers, upgrade your equipment, maybe even offer free cuts to anyone who needs one." Elliot stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You want to invest in my shop?" "I do," Charles said. "I'm not talking about charity. This is about turning what you're already doing into something sustainable, something that could help even more people. You'd still be in charge, I'm just here to support you." Elliot leaned back, his brow furrowed. "Why would you do that? What's in it for you?" Charles smiled faintly, setting his notebook down. "I've spent my whole life chasing profit margins and closing deals. And I've done well for myself, but it's hollow. When I saw you with that boy, it reminded me of something I'd lost sight of. Kindness, purpose, impact. This isn't about me, it's about what we could do together." Elliot didn't respond immediately. He glanced around the shop, at the faded chairs and scuffed floor, at the tools he had worked with for years. The idea of expanding, of helping more people, was both exhilarating and overwhelming. "I don't know," Elliot admitted. "It feels like I'd be giving up something. I've always believed in earning what I have." "You wouldn't be giving up anything," Charles said gently. "You'd be building on what you've already created." Elliot hesitated, his mind racing. The idea of turning his little barbershop into a community hub where anyone in need could feel welcome was tempting. But was he ready to take such a big leap? "Tell you what," Charles said, sensing Elliot's uncertainty. "Take some time to think about it. I'm not in a rush, and I want you to be comfortable with this." Elliot nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Charles. I'll give it some thought. As Charles left, the shop fell quiet. Elliot stood at the counter, staring at the coffee cup Charles had left behind. He thought of Jamie's bright smile, of the gratitude in the boy's eyes. For the first time in years, Elliot found himself imagining what might be possible if he took a chance. The days passed, and Elliot found himself unable to shake the conversation with Charles from his mind. Every time he glanced at his scuffed floor or the faded sign above the door, the possibility of doing something more crept back into his thoughts. Still, the leap Charles proposed felt enormous, almost too good to be true. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Jamie returned to the shop, his face alight with excitement. This time, he wasn't alone. A few other kids trailed behind him, each one looking as hesitant as Jamie had the first time he'd come in. Jamie bounded up to the counter, a soccer ball tucked under one arm. Mr. Elliot, he said, practically bouncing on his toes. These are my friends. They wanted to see if you'd cut their hair too. Elliot looked at the small group, taking in their patched-up clothes and hopeful expressions. His heart swelled. Of course, he said, his voice steady. Who's first? The kids giggled nervously before one of them, a boy with a mop of curls, stepped forward. Elliot guided him to the chair and got to work, chatting with the group as he snipped and shaped. By the time he'd finished all their haircuts, the shop was filled with laughter and easy conversation. The kids lingered for a while, reluctant to leave the warm, inviting space. As Jamie and his friends finally headed out into the rain, Elliot watched them go, their new haircuts giving them a confidence that made them seem taller somehow. He turned back to his chair, but his thoughts lingered on Charles's words. What if the shop could be more than just a place for haircuts? What if it could be a refuge, a source of hope for everyone who walked through its doors? Later that evening, as the rain drummed softly against the windows, Charles returned to the shop. He carried a folder under one arm, his usual air of quiet determination evident. Back so soon? Elliot asked, raising an eyebrow. Charles smiled. I wanted to check in. Have you thought any more about the proposal? Elliot sighed, setting down the clippers he'd been cleaning. I have. And I'll be honest, I'm still on the fence. It's not that I don't trust you. This shop has been my life for so long. Changing it feels scary. That's fair, Charles said, nodding. But think about what you did today. Those kids left here with more than just haircuts. They left with dignity, with a sense of being seen and cared for. Imagine if you could do that for hundreds of people, thousands even. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the decision pressing on him. It's not just about the money, Charles. It's about whether I can handle it. Whether I can live up to the vision you're talking about. Charles leaned forward, his expression serious. You're already doing it, Elliot. You've been doing it for years. I'm just here to help you amplify it. The rain continued to patter against the windows as Elliot stared at the folder Charles had placed on the counter. Inside were detailed plans for the shop's expansion, including cost breakdowns, timelines, and ideas for community outreach. It was thorough, thoughtful, and full of possibility. All right, Elliot said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Let's give it a shot. Charles's face broke into a grin. You won't regret it. This is going to be something incredible. In the weeks that followed, the shop underwent a transformation. A second barber chair was installed, along with new tools and fresh coats of paint in calming, inviting colors. A local artist volunteered to create a mural on one wall, depicting scenes of Maplewood and its residents. The new sign above the door now read Elliot's Barbershop Cuts with Care. Flyers went up around town, announcing the launch of free haircut Saturdays. The response was immediate. On the first Saturday, a line stretched down the block. Families, young professionals struggling to make ends meet, and retirees on fixed incomes all came through the doors, each one leaving with more than just a fresh haircut. They left with a renewed sense of pride and belonging. Elliot worked tirelessly, his hands moving with practiced precision as he chatted with each customer. Charles was there too, helping to manage the growing crowd and keeping things organized. By the end of the day, Elliot was exhausted but exhilarated. As he locked up the shop that evening, he turned to Charles. "You were right," he admitted. "This is bigger than I ever imagined." Charles smiled, clapping him on the back. "And we're just getting started." The weeks rolled on, and Elliot's barbershop became a beacon of hope in Maplewood. Word spread quickly about the free haircut Saturdays, and the community rallied behind the effort. Local businesses offered support in small but meaningful ways. A coffee shop down the street provided free beverages for the waiting customers, while a bakery donated trays of cookies to make the atmosphere even more welcoming. Elliot, though deeply committed to the growing mission, began to feel the weight of the increased workload. The constant stream of customers meant long hours and little rest, and while the expansion had brought new tools and a second barber, the demand often exceeded their capacity. By the end of each day, Elliot's feet ached, and his hands felt stiff from the endless cuts and trims. One Friday evening, after the last customer had left, Elliot slumped into a chair. Charles, as always, was nearby, flipping through his ever-present notebook. "You look like you've been through the ringer," Charles said with a grin, though his tone held genuine concern. Elliot chuckled wearily. "Feels like it. Don't get me wrong, I love what we're doing here, but I'm not as young as I used to be." Charles closed the notebook and leaned forward. "Maybe it's time to bring in more help." "I've thought about that," Elliot admitted. "But hiring more people means more expenses. Even with the donations and grants, I'm worried about stretching things too thin." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "You're right to be cautious, but there's more support out there than you might think. We've already got people rooting for us. Let's tap into that." True to his word, Charles got to work. He reached out to contacts in the nonprofit sector and pitched the idea of a larger community initiative centered on the barbershop. His passion and vision proved contagious. Within weeks, a retired barber from a neighboring town volunteered to work on Saturdays, and a local cosmetology school offered to send students to help as part of their training. A few young stylists, eager to give back, also joined the rotation, ensuring that no one had to wait long for their turn in the chair. With the additional help, the shop's atmosphere grew even livelier. Stories and laughter filled the air as customers of all ages and backgrounds came and went. Elliot found himself invigorated by the camaraderie and the sheer joy that now defined his days. One afternoon, Jamie walked into the shop with a pair of soccer cleats dangling over his shoulder. His face was radiant as he ran up to Elliot. "Mr. Elliot, look," he exclaimed, holding up the cleats. "The shoe store down the street gave these to me. They said they heard about me through you." Elliot grinned, his chest tightening with pride. "That's fantastic, Jamie. I bet you'll be the fastest one on the field now." Jamie nodded eagerly. "I'm going to score so many goals. And it's all because of you." Elliot knelt down, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's because of you, Jamie. You've got the heart and the determination. Don't ever forget that." The moment stayed with Elliot long after Jamie had left. Seeing the boy's confidence grow reminded him why he had taken this leap. It wasn't just about haircuts. It was about giving people the courage to chase their dreams, no matter their circumstances. That evening, as Elliot and Charles reviewed the week's events, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed to Elliot. Inside was a letter from a regional charity that had heard about the shop's efforts. The letter thanked Elliot for his work and included a check for $5,000, earmarked to help cover the shop's expenses and keep the free haircuts going. Elliot stared at the check, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Charles said simply. "You've earned this, Elliot. You've built something incredible, and people want to support it." Elliot nodded slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "This will help more than just the shop. I can finally catch up on some bills, maybe even fix a few things at home." Charles smiled. "You deserve it. You've spent so much time giving to others, it's time to let someone give back to you. Elliot folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his pocket. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his worries begin to lift. The community had given him the chance to keep doing what he loved, and he was determined to honor that trust. The transformation of Elliot's barbershop didn't stop with free haircut Saturdays or the influx of volunteers. It became something larger, a hub of compassion and connection that touched every corner of Maplewood. Each week brought new faces, not just those in need but also people looking to lend a hand. The barbershop became a symbol of what a community could achieve when kindness and generosity took center stage. On a crisp autumn morning, the shop was already bustling. Elliot was at his station, carefully trimming the hair of a young boy who chatted excitedly about his upcoming school play. Nearby, the retired barber, Frank, worked on a customer while the cosmetology students cheerfully swept up clippings and greeted newcomers. Charles stood by the door, clipboard in hand, keeping the flow organized and smooth. In the middle of the day, Elliot noticed a man lingering near the door. He was older, his clothes worn but clean, and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He seemed unsure, his gaze darting between the bustling shop and the street outside. Elliot excused himself from his station and approached the man with his usual warmth. "Hey there," he said. "Come on in. Need a haircut?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." "Not at all," Elliot said, guiding him to a chair. "What's your name?" "Joseph," the man replied quietly. As Elliot draped the cape around him, Joseph began to open up. He talked about losing his job at the factory and how he'd been living out of his car for the past few months. He hadn't had a haircut in almost a year. As Elliot worked, Joseph's posture seemed to shift. His shoulders straightened and his voice grew steadier. By the time Elliot finished, Joseph looked at himself in the mirror, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Thank you," Joseph said, his voice trembling. This means more than you know." Elliot patted him on the shoulder. "You're welcome here anytime, Joseph. And if you need help with anything else, let us know. We're all in this together." As Joseph left the shop, Charles approached Elliot. "That right there," Charles said, nodding toward the door, "is why this place matters. It's not just about haircuts, it's about giving people their dignity back." Elliot smiled, his heart full. "It's amazing, isn't it? I never thought the shop would become this. And there's still more we can do," Charles added. "I've been talking to a few folks about setting up a fund to provide job resources, like resume workshops or interview coaching. Imagine what a difference that could make for someone like Joseph." Elliot nodded, already imagining the possibilities. The shop had become so much more than a place for trims and shaves. It was a lifeline, a spark of hope for those who needed it most. And the idea of expanding that mission filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, after the last customer had left and the shop was quiet, Elliot and Charles sat together, reflecting on the journey they'd shared. The walls around them were now decorated with photos and thank you notes from customers, each one a testament to the impact the shop had made. "You know," Elliot said, sipping his coffee, "when you first walked in here with that notebook, I thought you were out of your mind." Charles laughed. "I probably was. But look at what we've done, Elliot. None of this would have been possible without you." Elliot shook his head. "Without us, Charles. You saw something in this little shop that I never did. And because of that, lives are changing." Outside, the streetlights cast a soft glow over the sidewalk, and the new sign above the shop door gleamed in the night. It read Elliot's Barbershop, where everyone belongs. For Elliot, those words weren't just a slogan. They were a promise to himself, to his community, and to every person who walked through his door. As he locked up for the night, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for what the shop had become but for the journey that had brought him here. In a world often focused on what divides us, Elliot had found his purpose in what brought people together. And he knew that no matter how much the barbershop grew, its heart would remain the same, a place of kindness, connection, and hope for all.